Thank you. I have to read it. I'm Rowena, and it's so good to be here at Chaucer's, our hometown bookseller.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chaucer's, and to introduce Arwen to you. Arwen's day job is teaching American history and the history of technology at the University of Delaware, and writing about her discoveries. American Imperialist is a dive into family history and the difference between stories and fact. Our mom's family, whom we knew best, had none of the immigrant stories and lore from the old country that my friends' families had. We had one, a great-grandmother who was born in Germany, and our father's mother who never dropped her English accent after a childhood spent in Britain as the daughter of an American diplomat. But our great-aunts and uncles on mom's side were born and educated in Europe as children of American missionaries. Arwen also discovered the good truths we never knew about our father's family. The matriarch of the Mohuns, Anna, supervising a family of educated literary women in Maryland, who was also Dorsey's grandmother, the subject of the book. And their Catholic connections that got the grandson's son into the civil service so he could support the family when he was young, and started him on his travels. The fascinating thing about the book for me was the mundane nature of how America got out into the world. We didn't have a really imperial hold on anything, but our bureaucrats were everywhere, pushing American business and American interests. And so they filtered through everything. And Dorsey is one of those. So, without further ado, Dr. Professor Arwen.
Thank you, Ro, and thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And I want to say a huge thank you to Chaucer's. I've been coming to this bookstore since the 1980s, maybe earlier. I think it was somewhere else before it was here. And when I decided to become a professional historian, I used to haunt that aisle back there. I still have on my desk Langer's World History Encyclopedia that I bought here sometime in the mid-80s. I got it for half price because it had the section on the modern Middle East stuck in upside down. And Mari, the then owner, gave me a deal on it. I think she felt sorry for me as well, or at least, wanted to encourage a young scholar who was buying a lot of books here. So I just want to tell you a little bit. I know you're all standing, so I'm not going to belabor this, but a little bit about what the book is about, and then I'll give you a little bit of a backstory about why I started to write it, and what I learned in that process, and a little bit about why I think that this story actually still matters. So let me begin by introducing the main character. He's the guy in the pith helmet in the lower corner of the book. And he always loved costuming. He always tried to have the right costuming for whatever gig he had. The gig he had at this point in time was to lead an expedition that crossed Africa with the purpose of building a telegraph line from Lake Tanganyika to the Congo River. This is taken around 1900, late 1890s, when he was on the banks of Lake Tanganyika waiting to start this project. I should say, incidentally, I know the names of the white guys in this photograph, and I have names of the Africans, but I can't for sure put names with faces. And it's one of the things that I wish I could have done in this book, actually, is to say more about the Africans. I have, when I could, tried to really flesh out their stories. So he was sort of in the middle of his career in this moment, a career that, as Rose said, started as an American bureaucrat. He worked as a trade consul in Congo, in a moment at which the King of Belgium owned, I don't think that's too strong a word, the center of Africa as a private colony, and was intent on exploiting it financially to the greatest extent that he could. So Dorsey, as I call him in the book, was this American who kind of ended up becoming a mercenary for Leopold. He resisted employment by Leopold for a while, and in fact he became a diplomat in Zanzibar, where our grandfather was born. But eventually the lure of a steady wage and a venture and being in charge of things was enough to draw him back into the Congo and to Leopold's employ. The story then takes him a lot of places, and you can read the book to learn more about it. There's a map in the front which I think sort of captures the extraordinary range of his travels. But this is a book which, in some ways, I've thought of it as a real world Heart of Darkness story. This is a story about a guy who, with the very best intentions, set out on a career that was really just about having a job, supporting his family. He was the eldest son of a widowed mother, and he gradually got sucked into what became one of the first great human rights crises of the 20th century. And he ended up on the wrong side of history. So I started writing this book because I just wanted to kind of add to this American history story about Americans in the world. But as I progressed and I learned more about it and came to think about this as a kind of real world Heart of Darkness story, I got more and more interested in the psychology of a person like him and how someone can end up in this kind of position. And I was also really interested in what I think of as the myth of American innocence, the way that Americans going out into the world have often thought that they could do well and do good, and that they were somehow immune from making the same kind of missteps as Europeans who belong to European empires. So in the process of researching this book, I stumbled across so many sources that I can kind of get inside his head a little bit. And I think one of the reasons for reading this book and why you might enjoy it is, and really learn something about American history and about our place in the world, is that I do try to unpack his psychology and think about how someone could do and participate in something like, what was effectively a genocide in the Congo. The other thing that I learned in the process of writing this book is how involved American capital was in the Congo. Leopold, at the end of his time when he was having the Congo sort of the global, or America and Europe, pressured him to let go of the Congo and hand it over to the Belgian people. Of course, they couldn't imagine that Africans could govern themselves in that moment in time. And in the last throes of this process, he gave American corporations the right to exploit minerals and rubber in about a third of the Congo. It's 1 million acres. And so Dorsey's last job was working for the American Congo Company. And the extent of American involvement in this part of the world is stunning, and it continued after his death. So they were looking for rubber and diamonds, but in the Second World War, much of the uranium for the atomic bomb came from Congo. And the cobalt in your cell phone that Apple has procured using child labor is the extension of this into the present. So this is a story which has a real resonance into the present. I also think he is a person who is a kind of prototype for a kind of American in the world that would become more and more common as European imperialism waned and kind of corporate imperialism, if you want to call it that, became more of the norm. So he's, I've sometimes thought of him as a freelancer. He was a freelance imperialist who worked for lots of different people depending on what was needed. Maybe that's a little bit of a downer. I think it also tells us truth, but it's a hell of a good story also. I also think of this as a travel book. My dad, my stepmother's here, and she knows my dad loved travel books, and I share that love, and I bought a lot of travel books back here. And I also tried to write a travel book and to give you a sense of these places and what they were like and the people he met as he traveled, not just through Africa, but through Europe and into Latin America early in his career. So that's a little taste of what this book is about, and I hope that at least some of you will pick it up and enjoy it, and I would be really happy to answer any questions you have or entertain your comments.
I'm hoping that did you include any of the things that you told us about your comments about the relationship to our current lives in the book? Or?
Yeah, I pulled it. So Stephen's asking, do I include any of this commentary about its connection to the present? Yes, I do, and I also connected up to the longer history of the family because that part of the family acquired intergenerational wealth as a consequence of this. So one of his sons was on the board of the New York Stock Exchange, and he got the sort of cultural cachet and the wealth to be able to do that. So one of the points that I want to make is that we don't really know enough about where the wealth came from in the United States in terms of the exploitation of Africa in this time period. There has been very little research about this, but it's clear that, he was a small player, but there were some big name families, including the Rockefellers and the Guggenheims, who made their wealth off of this process. So that's one of the ways that I bring it up into the present. Michael, I think you were...
I was just wondering about your sources and how you gathered all the information that you collected to be able to put this all together, and how many years it took. And,
yeah. So it started as this little side project. I was finishing another book, and it was when Ancestry first became sort of popular. So it started both because I was teaching American history, and when I got to the part where they talked about immigration, where the textbooks talked about immigration and Panama Canal, and I would say to the students, well, this is a big story, but this isn't my family story, and maybe it's not your family story either. And so that was one piece of it. But I was clicking on those little green leaves in the Ancestry. If you've done Ancestry, they're really addictive.
Yeah.
And I kept coming across more and more information about him. It turned out that son who was on the board of the New York Stock Exchange, had saved his papers, and he had a lot of pull, and he had the microfilmed in the 1950s, and then they were sent to Belgium to the Royal African Museum.
Yeah.
So I got the microfilm. It was 1,600 pages of documents, including diary, all this stuff. I'm a social historian. Usually if I get people's names, I'm really happy, and if I get a photograph, I'm super happy.
Yeah.
diaries and letters, and then he came from a family of women writers, and who were well connected in Washington D.C. and they left a huge paper trail behind them. So one of the most fun moments of this was I went into his civil service file in Washington in the National Archives, and there were all these letters from Rutherford B. Hayes, and I thought, that's so weird. So I called the Hayes Library and I asked, and I said his name, right? Mohun. It's very unusual. And the archivist I talked to said, oh yeah, Claire Mohun, she was Lucy Hayes' best friend. I have these huge file of her newspaper columns and letters. And I'll photocopy them for you and I'll send them to you. Wow. It's like, and this just kept, I mean, I was going to write a more collective biography of the family, but this just kept happening to me. Like every time I poked at a source or I asked a question, I got another kind of load of very, very high quality source material. So it just was so rich that I couldn't resist.
Sounds like a historian's dream
Yeah.
to be able to get all that information, plus the personal connection.
Yeah.
And if you could speak to the personal connection of your great-grandfather, and you were talking about the psychology interested you, if you can expand a little bit of your feelings of his psychology.
Well, people have asked me, you know, do you really want to tell this story? Are you sure you want to tell your story? How is your family going to feel about this story? And I would say, first of all, that my immediate family are people who really believe in outing the truth, right? When that if a story like this is important to tell, you should tell it and not worry about protecting the reputation of the family. I still to know whether I have distant cousins who are coming after me. That may happen. But also, he died in 1915. So no one who was living there was no one living by the time I started this book who knew him personally.
Okay.
And my dad's parents were divorced when he was very young, so he didn't really know his father. So this part of the family is really a mystery. And I enjoyed getting to know them, you know, especially these women were amazing people. And I think most people are good and bad and all kinds of things in between, uncomplicated. So I wasn't put off by that. And I ultimately concluded that he was a family man in an era in which the gender expectations were that you would be a breadwinner, not just for your immediate family, but for your extended family. And his sort of myopic focus on always having a job, making a living, supporting a family, it cost him hugely, and it cost, you know, the Africans that he worked with a lot more than that.
Yeah.
But it was very, at its core, this is a story about a family man, and about that era in which, you know, you were supposed to support your family, and the enormous price that can sometimes extract.
Yeah.
Could you read a favorite paragraph of your own?
Good question.
I was trying to decide up between the first and the last, and maybe I'll do both of them.
Great. Yeah.
Okay. He'd never intended to work for the Belgian king, but intentions aren't actions. Still, a few years earlier, he had turned down Leopold II's first job offer. The accusatory voices of journalists, friends, and reformers reinforced his reluctance. He recognized the truth in their dark stories. The king's eloquent promises of free trade and an end to slavery amounted to a clever ploy. Strategies designed to appease his European and American critics. Leopold's real goals were profit and control. The king's priorities mirrored those of the many men who found their way into his private African colony, the Congo Free State. During a stint as the U.S. trade agent in Congo, he'd seen with his own eyes unfettered greed and cruelty as Europeans scrambled to enrich themselves. More than seen, really, he'd done things that he now preferred to keep quiet. Burned villages, brutalized men in his employ, stood by while innocent people were killed for acts they had not committed. Since then, he'd married, become a father, gained some prudence. He had not, however, mustered the courage to completely cut his ties with Leopold. Now he was a breadwinner with what felt like limited options. The financial security of a multi-year contract would be a relief. Surely family responsibilities mattered more than taking a vaguely humanitarian stand by avoiding any more involvement with the Congo Free State, as his friend Roger Casement had done. If he was honest with himself, he also itched for a challenge. Perhaps he thought he could do better than other men in the king's employ. The decision was made. Work for Leopold in Africa. So I can read the last paragraph. I can find it. Dorsey's story also rebalances the emphasis in much recent historical writing about the Congo that casts kings, politicians, and reformers, most of whom never set foot in Africa, as heroes and villains. Dorsey was neither. Instead, he was a man not that dissimilar from his contemporaries in either ethics or worldview. However, he differed from so many other Gilded Age Americans, not only in benefiting from European imperialism, but also participating directly in it. In doing so, he confronted the kind of grave, moral, life and death choices most of them would never have to face, except in the comfortable space of their imaginations. This book is in no way aims to excuse what he did, but only to explain it.
Thank you.
Do you have any impulse to go there and see how it ended up, or at least read about it and inform yourself about what the Congo has turned into now? How many of those things are still very applicable to modern Congo?
Yeah, I've read a lot about the contemporary Congo, which is a mess.
It's a complete mess.
Yeah, and to be frank, I don't have the travel skills to be able to manage that, and I've read about what other people have done there, and I'm not sure it would be productive. I did intend, and I will someday go to Zanzibar in East Africa, where he also was, because I think that would give a better, maybe in a way, a better sense of what Africa was when he knew it. I have been to Southern Africa, but that's a different place with a different history. So it's a real dilemma, and I've opened myself up to criticism because I have not done I'm not an African historian, so I haven't done what African historians would do, which is to go to Africa and do oral histories. I'm not actually convinced. I have a friend who's African history. She says, maybe people remember him. I think that's actually a very kind of ethnocentric perspective, is to say that, this white guy who passed through is that 100 years later people are talking about him. I'm not convinced that, he was that important to most people that were living there. I think he was important in indirect ways on people's lives, but So that's a long answer to say, I would love to go. I'm just not sure I want to risk my life.
It's
in
one of the more
Congo.
difficult countries to travel in.
Yeah,
And just keep from getting robbed and stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of chaos and
yeah, and
still because of
yeah,
the
and
way it was treated in the past.
yeah, I think to travel there with any degree of safety, you end up in a bubble anyway, and then that defeats the purpose, right? But under the right circumstances, certainly I would go.
Any more questions? Do we have, oh, right here.
A friend of mine rushed up to me at the Botanic Garden and said, I am reading the best book. It is called American Imperialist, Susan Mohan's family, and it's such a good book that I'm taking notes. I want to remember it all. And my question is, I think you've succeeded, apparently, in combining narrative appeal with scholarship. Is that a difficult kind of a challenge?
Oh, absolutely. But biography, this is the first biography I've written. And biography is storytelling, and it's about people. So it has a kind of built-in appeal. And it has been a really fun kind of history to write because you also have to know about everything. So that immersion in those, Redford O'Hanlon, all these travel writers has given me this sense about how you construct that narrative so that the reader becomes part of the journey, right? And also feels like they know the people in the story. I'll let you in on a little secret though about biography. He's long dead, and in a way, he's the product of my imagination, right? Because I don't know for sure who he was, except through, mostly his own writings and what people wrote about him, but that is definitely curated. There are things that he never wrote down, and because he came from a family of writers, he was someone who was aware of narrative. I have a little fun in the book actually with his storytelling because he published a few stories and he would tell the same story different ways, different audiences. But yeah, that's always the challenge. All my books I've tried to write in a way that was completely accessible to a general audience, and I have gotten letters. I wrote a book about the steam laundry industry, and I got letters from old laundrymen, which I thought was just a hoot, that, and I had never been inside a laundry, and they said, oh yeah, you completely got our world. It's miraculous how the historical method can work, that you have this, you talk to dead people and something if not real, truthful comes out of it. That other people recognize as truthful. So, yeah, thank you for your relating your friend's experience, because that's definitely what I was aiming for, is to make people think, but also have fun on this amazing journey with this unusual guy.
One more question? So in closing, if you could, what was your experience like writing and researching, per your personal feelings?
I love historical research. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a detective, and I love this process of having a mystery, a question, something I don't know, something I don't understand, and then figuring out a way to get an answer to that question. And this book also took me I love to travel, and this book took me to all kinds of different kinds of places and introduced me to all kinds of different kinds of people. The most unusual place I did research was in a Dominican nunnery in Ohio. Dorsey's sister was a mother superior there, and a bunch of family papers had ended up there, and they gave me the keys to their library. And there was this woman who deserves a book. Well, she has a book written about her, sort of. But she went to China after when the Chinese Revolution was happening, and she pulled out all the Dominican nuns and brought them back to Ohio. And I go around the corner in this nunnery, and there'd be this tiny little Chinese woman. You know, some of them were still alive in their 90s. So the experience for me was this kind of very exciting and sometimes frustrating process of being a detective, and then figuring out how to tell a story. And I think one of the hardest things about writing is that you write for yourself first, and then you have to put a lot of that, you have to cut a lot of that and tell the story in a way that it'll appeal to other people.
Yeah.
And that's extremely painful. So I was really lucky to have gotten an amazing editor who not only was good at editing, but his father was a historian, so he knew about the care and feeding of people that learn all this stuff and you can't let go of it, you know.
Yeah.
He knew how to pry my hands off some of the stories that would have slowed down the narrative in the book.
Well,
I have one more question. Is there a specific revelation or discovery you could share with us? You talk about being exciting. You know, you probably encountered something. What was a specific piece of the story that animated your research?
The first thing comes to mind isn't actually a story, but I knew from his diaries that there was an African guy that he called Philip that was assigned to him when he came to Congo the first time to travel with him. And I mean, they called him a boy, right, in the parlance of the day. And my dad had a cardboard box with photographs in the garage, and he pulled it out for me, and I started going through there, and there was Dorsey and Philip. Oh my gosh. I mean, I never in a million years thought I would know what he looked like. I mean, it is, I guess, a research discovery that to see this person about whom there are only a few sentences in their written work, but there he was, you know, in a photograph. It gives me goosebumps thinking about it even now.
He was probably a key figure in Dorsey's life for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
All the contacts, language, facility, and it's interesting.
Yeah, and I filled out his story by researching what other historians have written about these kind of intermediaries, is what historians call them, these people who, because he didn't speak the language at all, and so he needed a lot of help, and that was Philip. So there's a picture of Philip in the book.
oh, that's great.
Yeah, yeah, and as much as I could piece together about his history and life.
Well, Arwen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Arwen.
Arwen Mohun.